In October 2023, the EPA fined a truck owner in Harris County, Texas, $35,840 for operating a 2019 Cummins-powered Ram 3500 with a DPF delete, an EGR delete, and a delete tuner installed. The vehicle had been flagged during a random roadside emissions sweep conducted by the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. That man's truck was seized, impounded, and he was ordered to restore it to stock configuration at his own expense before it could be released. He spent over $11,000 in restoration costs, penalties, and storage fees. That story is not an outlier. That story is the new normal. I'm Wade Tucker. I've been turning wrenches on diesel trucks since 1986, when I started at my uncle's shop in Odessa, Texas, working on early Ford F-250s with the 6.9-liter IDI Cummins. I've built hundreds of diesel trucks over 4 decades. I've seen every modification, every workaround, every trick in the book. And I'm telling you right now, the era of the diesel delete as we knew it is functionally over. Not because the trucks got better, not because the technology changed, because the federal government decided to enforce laws that have been on the books for 30 years, and now they're coming for your shop, your truck, and your livelihood. Subscribe, drop a comment at the end. I want to know what you're driving and whether you've dealt with any of this firsthand. Let me start with what we actually mean when we talk about a diesel delete, because a lot of people throw the word around without understanding what's physically happening under the hood. A modern diesel pickup, whether it's a Cummins in a Ram, a Duramax in a GM, or a Power Stroke in a Ford, comes from the factory loaded with emissions equipment designed to reduce the pollutants that diesel engines produce. That equipment includes several distinct systems, and a delete typically means removing some or all of them. The first system is the exhaust gas recirculation valve, known as the EGR. This valve routes a portion of hot exhaust gases back into the engine's intake manifold to lower combustion temperatures and reduce the formation of nitrogen oxides, which are major contributors to smog and respiratory problems. The problem is that EGR valves on diesel engines get clogged with carbon deposits over time. They fail. They cause intake manifold gaskets to fail. They cause coolant loss. Mechanics have been dealing with EGR-related failures on 6.0 and 6.4 Power Strokes for 20 years. Removing the EGR system eliminates that failure point and keeps the intake tract clean. The second system is the diesel particulate filter, or DPF. This is a honeycomb-shaped ceramic filter installed in the exhaust stream that captures soot and ash particles from the exhaust. As it fills up, the truck runs a regeneration cycle, either passive or active, where it burns off the accumulated soot at very high temperatures, converting it to ash. The problem is that regeneration doesn't always complete fully, especially if you're doing short drives or idling a lot. The DPF fills up, the truck goes into limp mode, and you end up needing an expensive replacement. A DPF delete removes the filter entirely, and a programmer or tuner is used to prevent the truck from attempting regeneration. The third system is the diesel exhaust fluid, commonly called DEF. This is a liquid solution of urea and deionized water that's injected into the exhaust stream ahead of the selective catalytic reduction system, or SCR. When the DEF decomposes, it releases ammonia, which reacts with nitrogen oxides in the SCR catalyst and converts them into nitrogen and water vapor. DEF is consumed as you drive, and the tank needs periodic refilling. If you run out of DEF, the truck derates severely. Some models limit you to 5 miles per hour. A DEF delete removes the injection system and the SCR catalyst, eliminating the need for DEF entirely. When people talk about a full delete, they're typically removing all 3 systems, EGR, DPF, and DEF, and installing a tuner or programmer that rewrites the engine's calibration so the truck runs properly without any of those components. The most common tuners used for this purpose are units like the EFI Live, the HP tuners, the Sniper from BD Performance, and various offerings from companies like Kinetic. These tuners allow you to adjust fueling, timing, and boost pressure to make power while keeping the engine from throwing fault codes or going into limp mode without the emissions equipment installed. So why do people do it? Let's be honest about the motivations, because this channel is about real information, not politics. The primary reason is reliability. EGR systems on modern diesel engines fail regularly and expensively. The 6-liter Power Stroke EGR cooler is notorious for failing and causing coolant to enter the combustion chamber, leading to hydrolock and catastrophic engine failure. The 6.7-liter Power Stroke EGR system has its own issues. The 6.7-liter Cummins in the Ram has a history of EGR cooler failures as well. Replacing an EGR cooler on a 6-liter Power Stroke can run $3,000 to $5,000 in labor alone if you're doing it right. Delete the EGR and you remove that entire failure mode. The second reason is performance. A delete combined with a quality tune can add significant horsepower and torque. A truck that came from the factory with 385 horsepower and 900 pound-feet of torque on a 2020 Ram 3500 with the 6.7-liter Cummins can be tuned to produce well over 500 horsepower and well over 1,100 pound-feet of torque with the right combination of delete parts and calibration. That matters to people who tow heavy loads, who haul for a living, who need their truck to perform in demanding conditions. The third reason is fuel economy. Diesel owners who delete their trucks and recalibrate the engine often report gains of 1 to 3 miles per gallon. Over the life of a truck that drives 30,000 miles a year, that adds up. If you're burning 400 gallons less diesel per year at $4 a gallon, that's $1,600 in savings. Over a 5-year ownership period, you're talking about real money. The fourth reason is maintenance cost. A new DPF on a late model diesel pickup costs between $3,000 and $7,000 installed, depending on the make and model. Replacing an EGR cooler and associated gaskets on a 6.0-liter Power Stroke can easily exceed $4,000 when you factor in the manifold, the cooler, the gaskets, and the labor. DEF consumption on some trucks can be surprisingly high. Some owners report having to add DEF every 5,000 miles, which adds up. Removing all of those systems eliminates those costs. So we've established why people do deletes. Now let's talk about what the law actually says, because this is where a lot of people are operating on complete misinformation. The Clean Air Act, passed by Congress in 1970 and substantially amended since then, is the federal law that governs vehicle emissions in the United States. Section 203A of the Clean Air Act specifically prohibits anyone from tampering with, defeating, or rendering inoperative any emission control device or element of design that's installed on a motor vehicle or motor vehicle engine. That language is broad. It was written that way intentionally. The EPA has interpreted Section 203A1B to prohibit the manufacture, sale, or installation of devices that defeat or bypass emission controls. That means it's illegal to make the parts, it's illegal to sell the parts, and in many interpretations, it's illegal to install them. The penalty structure was updated significantly in 2024. As of the most recent EPA enforcement guidelines, civil penalties for violations of the Clean Air Act's tampering provisions can reach $44,539 per violation per vehicle. A first-time shop owner in Colorado received fines totaling $2.3 million in 2022 for performing delete installations on over 100 vehicles. The EPA has the authority to refer criminal cases to the Department of Justice when they determine that the violations were willful and deliberate. Those criminal penalties can include imprisonment. I want to be very specific here because this is where people get confused. The federal law applies everywhere in the United States. However, the enforcement of that law varies dramatically by state, and that's a critical distinction that affects what you can and cannot get away with, depending on where you live. California has the most aggressive enforcement posture, and that's not new. California has had authority to set its own emissions standards under the Clean Air Act for decades, and it uses that authority aggressively. The California Air Resources Board, known as CARB, has its own regulations that are stricter than federal standards in many respects. CARB has made it illegal to sell or install delete parts on vehicles registered in California. CARB also requires emissions testing as part of the vehicle registration process, and that testing includes onboard diagnostics checks that can detect when emission control systems have been tampered with. If you're caught with a delete in California, you face both state and federal penalties, and the California penalties can be substantial on top of the federal ones. Texas presents a more complicated picture. Texas does not have a state-level emissions testing requirement in most counties. Many counties in Texas are exempt from emissions testing because they don't meet the population thresholds that trigger the requirement under federal law. However, that doesn't mean you're safe. The Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, known as TCEQ, has authority to conduct roadside emissions inspections, and it has been doing so with increasing frequency in recent years. TCEQ has been working with the EPA on enforcement actions in Texas, and as I mentioned earlier, the Harris County case from 2023 is a direct result of that partnership. If you're driving a deleted truck in Texas and you get pulled over by a TCEQ inspector or end up in a situation where your truck is inspected, you are not protected by the lack of a mandatory inspection program. Colorado has been one of the most aggressive states in terms of shop enforcement. In 2021, the EPA reached a settlement with a shop in the Denver area for performing delete installations. The settlement included penalties and a permanent injunction against the shop owner, preventing them from continuing the practice. The shop was required to pay a substantial fine and to notify all past customers of the violations. This created a domino effect where those customers faced their own potential liability. That case was a warning shot. The industry didn't treat it that way, but it should have. Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, and most of the Northeast have mandatory biennial emissions inspections that include OBD2 checks on diesel vehicles 2008 and newer. Those inspections are extremely effective at detecting delete software and missing emissions equipment. If you have a deleted truck in Pennsylvania and you take it for an inspection, the odds of passing are essentially zero. The OBD2 system logs fault codes and monitors the status of the DPF, the EGR system, and the DDF system. When those systems are removed, the monitor status goes to not ready, and that's an automatic failure. The states with the least enforcement are those without mandatory inspection programs, primarily in the rural Mountain West, the rural South, and parts of the Midwest. States like Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, and Mississippi have minimal or no emissions inspection requirements. If you live in one of those states, you have historically had more operational latitude. But I want to be very clear about something. The lack of state-level enforcement does not mean you are operating legally. The EPA enforcement actions are federal, and they apply in every state, regardless of whether that state has its own inspection program. If the EPA decides to come after you, they don't need a state inspector to flag your truck. They can act on information they obtain through other means, including tips, complaints, and undercover operations. Now let me talk about what I consider one of the most significant developments in this space, and that's the pressure that tuner manufacturers are facing from federal authorities. The companies that make the tuners, EFI Live, HP Tuners, and others, are not operating in a legal vacuum, and they know it. In 2022, the EPA sent formal communications to several companies that manufacture and sell emissions defeat devices, informing them that their products were in violation of federal law and that continued sale could result in enforcement action. The outcome of those communications has varied. Some companies have modified their product lines to restrict functionality in states with strict enforcement. Some companies have added disclaimers and warnings to their products. Some companies continue to operate largely unchanged, betting that enforcement resources are limited and that prosecution is unlikely. But the legal landscape is shifting. In 2023, the Department of Justice under the Biden administration signaled an increased willingness to pursue civil and criminal cases against companies that manufacture and sell defeat devices. That posture has continued into 2024 and 2025. The legal risk for tuner companies is real, and any shop owner or individual who relies on those tuners should understand that the manufacturer might not be around to support that product indefinitely. If you bought an expensive tuning device and the company gets shut down or forced to stop selling it, you're left holding expensive hardware that may become useless or unsupported. Here's what happens during an inspection when a truck has been deleted. Modern diesel trucks are monitored by an OBD2 system that's constantly checking the status of every emissions component. When you remove the DPF, the truck's computer recognizes that the DPF is no longer present and sets a fault code. When you remove the EGR valve, the computer recognizes that the EGR circuit is open and sets a fault code. When you disable the DEF system, the computer detects that the DEF quality sensor and injection system are no longer functioning and sets multiple fault codes. A competent emissions inspector with a modern scan tool can identify a deleted truck within minutes. It's not subtle. It's not something you can hide with a simple tune. The monitors go to not ready, the fault codes accumulate, and the inspection fails. Some owners have attempted to use masking devices or closed-loop tuning strategies to try to pass inspections, but these workarounds have become increasingly ineffective as inspection standards have improved. The OBD2 system on 2019 and newer trucks is sophisticated enough that many of these tricks no longer work reliably. The current enforcement environment is the most aggressive it's been since the early 2000s, when the EPA first began targeting cigarette boat manufacturers and large diesel truck fleet operators for emission violations. Since 2022, the EPA has conducted over 200 enforcement actions related to vehicle emissions tampering, with a significant portion of those actions targeting diesel pickup truck modifications. The agency has been working with state environmental agencies, has been using information obtained from warranty claims and insurance claims, and has been conducting undercover operations at shops that perform delete installations. In one case that made headlines in the diesel community, a shop in California was raided by EPA investigators and the California ARB in a coordinated action. The shop owner was charged under both federal and state law. The investigation found that the shop had performed delete installations on over 300 vehicles over a period of 4 years. The penalties exceeded $4 million when you factored in the federal fines, the state fines, and the cost of required remediation. The shop owner was barred from operating in the state and faced potential criminal charges. This is not theoretical. This is not an exaggeration. This is happening right now to real people who thought they were running a legitimate business. Now let's talk about what you can actually do about this situation if you own a deleted truck or if you're considering a delete. I'm not going to moralize at you. I'm not going to tell you you're a bad person for wanting to modify your truck. I understand why people do it, and I've helped people do it for decades. But I am going to tell you what your actual options are in the current environment. Option 1 is to run your deleted truck as is and accept the risk. If you live in a state without mandatory inspection and you don't drive your truck across state lines frequently, your practical risk is relatively low in the short term. However, that risk is not zero, and it's increasing every year as enforcement resources are allocated and as the used truck market draws scrutiny from regulators who are aware of the issue. If your truck is involved in an accident and an insurance adjuster notes the delete, that information can be reported to environmental authorities. If you take your truck to a dealer for warranty work and the technician notices the delete, that can be reported. If you sell the truck and the buyer registers it in a state with aggressive enforcement, that can create liability for you as the previous owner. Option 2 is to restore your truck to stock configuration. This is the legally safest option, and it's one that some truck owners are choosing, particularly those who live in states with mandatory inspection or who are planning to sell their truck in the near future. Restoring a deleted truck to stock is expensive. You're looking at the cost of new EGR components, a new DPF, new DEF injectors, and potentially new engine calibration. On a truck that had a full delete done, that restoration can easily cost $6,000 to $10,000, depending on the make and model and the quality of the parts you use. Option 3 is to use a delete-in-a-box product that allows you to maintain the ability to toggle between a delete tune and a stock tune. Some tuners on the market now offer features that allow you to revert to a stock calibration, which can allow you to pass an inspection and then switch back to your performance tune afterward. I'm not endorsing this as a legal strategy, and I want to be clear about that. The law in most jurisdictions treats the parts installation as a violation, regardless of whether you can toggle back and forth. But I would be failing to give you complete information if I didn't mention that this is a strategy that some owners are using in the current environment. Option 4 is to buy a truck that doesn't need a delete. Modern diesel trucks from 2020 onward have dramatically improved reliability compared to their predecessors. The 6.7 Cummins and Ram trucks from 2019 onward has been significantly more reliable than the earlier 6.7 engines. The 6.7 Power Stroke introduced in 2020 has been robust. The L5P Duramax from GM has been solid. If you buy a newer truck and maintain it properly, you may not need the delete to get the reliability and performance you want. Is it the same as a deleted truck? No, but it's a legitimate path forward that doesn't involve federal penalties. Here's the honest bottom line from my perspective after 40 years in this industry. The delete, as we knew it in the 2000s and 2010s, when you could take your truck to a local shop, spend $3,000 or $4,000, and get a setup that made big power and nobody ever bothered you about it, that era is over. The enforcement environment has changed. The legal risk has changed. The availability of the parts and the support infrastructure has changed. That doesn't mean deletes aren't happening. They're happening. But they're happening in an environment where the stakes are higher than they've ever been. What comes next is probably a bifurcated market. One segment of truck owners will continue to do deletes despite the risk, will move their business underground, and will operate in a legal gray area that works until it doesn't. Another segment will move toward compliance, will buy newer trucks that don't need modification to be reliable, and will accept the trade-offs that come with that. And there's probably a middle ground where the industry develops new products and new approaches that provide some of the benefits of the delete without the full legal exposure. Products that improve reliability and performance while maintaining the stock emissions hardware, for example. The EPA is not going to stop. The enforcement posture has been consistent and escalating since 2022. The states are cooperating more closely with federal authorities than they have in the past. The technology for detecting deletes at inspection is improving. If you own a deleted truck today, you need to make your own decision about your risk tolerance. I'm not going to make that decision for you, but I want you to make it with complete information about what you're actually dealing with. If this video was useful to you, subscribe. Hit the bell. Drop a comment below. Tell me what you're driving, what you've done to it, and whether you've had any encounters with inspectors or enforcement. I read every comment. I'll respond to as many as I can. This is a community, and we need to be honest with each other about what's actually happening out there, not what we wish was happening. Stay safe, stay legal, and keep your trucks running.